Somewhere in this story, a woman is about to have a ring pushed onto her finger by a man who has never once in his life made a mistake in public. And in less than 4 seconds, that mistake is going to change the fate of 2 crime families, 1 dying peace treaty, and every plan he has spent 3 years building. He does not know it yet. Neither does she. But by the time this story ends, you will understand why people still whisper about the wedding at the Rourke estate. The one where the boss put the ring on the wrong woman, and she said one sentence that made an entire ballroom go silent. Her name was Wren Ashby, and she was not supposed to be standing at that altar. She was supposed to be 3 feet to the left, in the shadow of the floral arch, watching the crowd the way she had been trained to watch crowds, scanning hands, not faces, because hands were what killed people, not expressions. She had been doing this job, in one form or another, for 6 years. Bodyguard was the word people used when they wanted to be polite about it. Wren preferred the word she'd earned in the Marine Corps, in a program that didn't officially exist, in a file that had her name misspelled on purpose. She preferred the word ghost, because a ghost was something you didn't see until it was already too late to matter. Vivienne Calder was the one who was supposed to be standing at that altar. Vivienne, 26 years old, daughter of Desmond Calder, the last living patriarch of a family that had run the Western Docks for 2 generations before the Rourke Syndicate swallowed half their territory and left them the choice every dying family eventually faces: bleed out slowly, or marry the man who beat you. Desmond Calder had chosen marriage, not out of love, out of arithmetic, his daughter's hand, in exchange for a truce that would let his family keep breathing for 1 more generation. And the man on the other side of that arithmetic was Salem Rourke. Salem Rourke was 36 years old, and if you had passed him on the street in a plain gray overcoat, you might have mistaken him for a man who owned nothing more dangerous than a shipping company, which on paper was exactly what he was: Rourke Maritime Holdings. 40% of the port traffic on the Gulf moved through paperwork, with his name buried 3 subsidiaries deep. What didn't appear on any paperwork was the other 40%, the kind that moved in the dark, under manifest numbers that didn't correspond to anything that had ever been legally manufactured. Salem did not raise his voice. He had learned a long time ago that men who shout are men who are afraid someone might stop listening. Salem never had that fear. When he spoke, rooms went quiet on their own, the way a forest goes quiet before a storm, not because anyone was told to be silent, but because something in the air made silence feel like the only safe option. He had pale gray eyes that people described, when they thought he couldn't hear them, as the color of a blade before it's used. He wore a signet ring on his right hand that had belonged to his father, and beneath his shirt, along his collarbone, there was a scar shaped like a question mark that no one, not even the men who had known him for 20 years, had ever been allowed to ask about. He did not want this wedding. Peace, to Salem Rourke, was a useful lie you told your enemies while you finished deciding whether to destroy them. But his underboss, a sharp, quietly ambitious man named Cassian Vale, had spent 8 months convincing him that swallowing the Calders through marriage was cleaner than swallowing them through war: less blood, same result, and a docks operation that would fold into Rourke's without a single dock worker needing to disappear into the bay. Salem had agreed, the way he agreed to most things Cassian proposed, with a long silence and then a single nod that ended the conversation. What Salem did not know, what no one in that ballroom knew, except for one woman standing very still near the floral arch, was that Cassian Vale had no intention of letting that wedding succeed, because a peace between the Rourkes and the Calders was the one outcome that guaranteed Cassian would spend the rest of his career as a well-dressed employee instead of what he believed, in the quiet architecture of his own ambition, he deserved to be: an empire. His empire. built on the wreckage of a war that everyone else would assume the Calders started. Wren had found the first thread of it 11 days earlier, a shipment manifest that didn't match a payment record, routed through an account that led, after 4 hours of digging in a hotel room with the lights off, to a name that should never have appeared anywhere near Cassian Vale's ledgers. She hadn't told Desmond Calder yet. She hadn't told Vivian. She had learned in this line of work that you don't share a suspicion until you can back it with something that can't be talked away in a 5-minute conversation. And she was 3 days from having that proof when Vivian came to her the night before the wedding, with her hands shaking and her voice barely above a whisper. "Someone left this on my pillow," Vivian had said, holding out a small white card. On it, in handwriting meant to look like no handwriting at all, were 6 words. "Smile at the altar." It's the last one. Wren had not slept that night. She had walked the estate's grounds 3 times, mapped every sightline from the surrounding tree line, memorized the position of every staff member who had access to the ballroom, and found nothing that told her who had written those words or how they planned to make them true, which was, in its own way, worse than finding something. A threat you can't locate is a threat that's already inside the walls. So when the morning of the wedding came, Wren made a decision that broke 4 separate protocols she had spent her career building. She put on a matching veil. She told the wedding coordinator there had been a change. The bride wanted a companion beside her at the altar, a tradition from her late mother's side of the family. No one was to question it. And she positioned herself 1/2 step behind and to the left of Vivian Calder, close enough to put her own body between the bride and anything that came from the crowd, invisible enough that from more than 10 feet away, in a veil that matched exactly, the 2 women were nearly impossible to tell apart. It should have worked as a shield. It was never supposed to make her the bride. The ceremony moved the way these arrangements always move, a priest neither family particularly believed in, reciting words neither family particularly meant, while 300 guests, who represented the entire criminal architecture of the Gulf Coast, watched 2 dynasties fold into one. Salem stood at the altar in black, unreadable, his eyes moving once, briefly, across the crowd in the automatic sweep of a man who has survived 17 years by never fully trusting a room. Cassian Vale stood 4 feet behind him, his hands folded, his face arranged into the practiced calm of a man who is about to watch something he engineered begin to unfold exactly as he designed it. Wren saw him first. Not Cassian, the man near the 2nd row of chairs on the left, wearing catering black, holding a tray of champagne flutes that he had not, in the 11 days Wren spent studying every hired vendor's face and file, ever actually seen before. A man whose hands were wrong. Waiters hold trays loose, at the fingertips, ready to pivot. This man held his tray flat against his forearm, braced, the way you hold something when your other hand needs to be free and fast. Her pulse didn't spike. That was the part of her training that never left. The calm that arrived exactly when panic should have. She watched his right hand drift toward the inside of his jacket as the priest reached the final line of the vows, the line where 2 people were asked to join hands, the exact half-second when every eye in that ballroom would be fixed on the altar and nowhere else. The perfect window. The kind of window someone plans for 11 days, the way Wren had been planning for 11 days to stop them. There was no time to speak, no time to signal. Vivian's hand was already lifting toward Salem's. The priest's mouth was already open on the word, rings, and the man in catering black was already closing his fingers around something inside his jacket that was not a wine key. So Wren did the only thing a ghost knows how to do when the moment for subtlety runs out. She moved. It happened in under 2 seconds, and to almost every person in that ballroom, it looked like nothing more than a strange, slightly too quick shift of the bride's veil, as though a gust of wind from the open terrace doors had caught the fabric and made her stumble half a step sideways. What actually happened was this. Wren's hand closed hard around Vivian's wrist, wrenching her back and down, out of the exact vertical line where a bullet fired from 4 feet away, aimed at heart height for a woman roughly 5'6", would have found her. In the same motion, Wren stepped forward into the space Vivian had occupied a heartbeat earlier, into the gap between the bride and groom, into the precise position where 2 hands were supposed to meet, into the last 2 feet of open air, before Salem Rourke, mid-motion, mid-vow, already reaching forward with the ring between his fingers, closed his hand around hers instead. The gunman never got the shot. Whether it was the sudden, unnatural blur of movement at the altar that broke his nerve, or the fact that his angle had shifted the instant the bride's veil moved somewhere it shouldn't have, no one would ever be entirely certain. What is certain is that a heartbeat later, one of the Rourke Syndicate's own security men, a quiet former Army sniper named Otis, who had spent the entire ceremony bored out of his mind near the terrace doors, saw the same wrong hand movement Wren had seen 30 seconds earlier, and put the caterer on the floor with a single silent strike to the throat before the man's weapon ever cleared his jacket. But none of that had happened yet in the ballroom's collective understanding. All 300 guests, all 4 generations of 2 criminal families, and the priest still holding the small velvet ring box, saw only this. The bride stumbled. Her companion, some young woman in a matching veil no one could quite place, caught her, and in catching her, ended up standing exactly where the bride should have been standing. And Salem Rourke, already in motion, already extending the ring toward the hand in front of him, with the same absolute, unbothered composure he brought to everything in his life, slid a heavy gold band onto the finger of a woman he had never seen before in his life. The silence that followed was not the ordinary silence of an interrupted ceremony. It was the silence of 300 dangerous people simultaneously recalculating whether what they had just watched was an accident, an omen, or the opening move of something none of them yet understood. Salem looked down. He looked at the hand in his, smaller than he expected, a faint white scar tracing across 2 knuckles that spoke of a life that had not spent its years in ballrooms. And then he looked up, past a veil that was subtly, unmistakably wrong. Wrong height by half an inch. Wrong posture. Too still. Too grounded. Weight distributed the way soldiers stand, and brides never do. Wrong eyes. Vivian Calder's eyes were a soft hazel that Salem had memorized out of due diligence 3 weeks earlier, the way he memorized every detail of anyone he was about to be legally bound to. The eyes looking back at him now were a cold storm gray that belonged to no photograph he had ever been shown. For 1 full second, Salem Rourke, a man who had once negotiated a hostage exchange without his pulse rising above 60, said absolutely nothing. His men would later say they had never seen him that still. Not angry, still. Not calculating still. Something closer to a machine that had just encountered a variable it had no protocol for. Behind him, Cassian Vale's carefully composed face cracked for exactly 1 frame, a flicker of something between fury and disbelief, before he smoothed it back into concern, stepping forward with a hand raised toward the confusion. "Something's happened to the bride," he said smoothly, already reaching for authority over the moment, already preparing to steer 300 witnesses toward whatever version of events would let his plan survive contact with its own failure. "Get Miss Calder to... don't move." The words did not come from Salem. They came from the woman standing in his hand's grip, in a veil that was not hers, wearing a ring that was not meant for her, in a voice that carried none of the tremor a room like that would have expected from a stranger who had just been publicly, mistakenly married into one of the most dangerous families on the Gulf Coast. She lifted her free hand and pulled the veil back herself, unhurried, revealing a face no one in that room recognized, and gray eyes that swept the crowd once, not with fear, but with the flat, cataloging calm of someone finishing a job she had started 11 days earlier and had no intention of leaving unfinished now. "There's a man on the floor by the second row," she said, her voice pitched to Carrie, who was 30 seconds from putting a bullet in the real bride's chest. "And the person who hired him is standing 4 feet behind the man whose ring I'm currently wearing." 300 people did not move. Somewhere near the back, a chair scraped against marble and then went still, as though its owner had thought better of drawing attention to himself. Desmond Calder, who had been seated in the front row watching his daughter's wedding, with the tight, controlled face of a man burying old grievances for the sake of his family's survival, rose halfway out of his seat, his eyes darting first to Vivian, alive, unharmed, being quietly steadied by Otis near the terrace doors, and then to the stranger standing at the altar in his daughter's place. Salem still hadn't let go of her hand. "Say that again," he said. Quiet. The particular quiet that every person in his organization had learned, over the years, to fear more than shouting ever could. "Your underboss," Wren said, "arranged for a shooter dressed as catering staff to kill Vivian Calder at the exact moment your hands joined, because a successful peace between your families is the one outcome that ends his plans to take your empire out from under you. I've had 11 days of financial records that prove where his money's been moving. I imagine your man on the floor over there can confirm the rest once he wakes up." For a long, suspended moment, nobody in that ballroom breathed the way rooms are supposed to breathe. And then Cassian Vale did the thing that every guilty man eventually does when the walls close faster than his story can adapt. He ran. He didn't get far. 6 feet, maybe 7, before Otis's second strike of the afternoon put him face down on the same marble floor as the unconscious shooter, and 2 of Salem's other men, moving on instinct, built from years of reading their boss's silences, converged on him before he could reach the terrace doors. Salem Rourke watched all of it happen without releasing the hand in his. When the room had gone from chaos back to a tense, watchful stillness, when Cassian Vale was being hauled upright with his wrists pinned behind him, when Desmond Calder had reached the altar with Vivian trembling but unhurt against his side, Salem finally turned his attention fully back to the woman, still standing where his bride should have been. "Who are you?" he said. It was not strictly a question. It came out the way he said most things, an instruction disguised as curiosity, an expectation that the world answer him promptly. "Wren Ashby," she said. "I've been Vivian's protection detail for 6 months. Her father hired me privately. Nobody outside a very short list was supposed to know that, which was the entire point. You knew about the shooter. I suspected someone would move today. I didn't know it would be him specifically until I saw his hands 40 seconds before he reached for his weapon." She glanced, briefly, at the ring still on her finger, then back up at Salem's face, unreadable and precise. "I didn't plan to end up wearing this, for what it's worth." A muscle moved in Salem's jaw, the closest thing to a visible reaction most people in that room had ever seen from him. "You put yourself between a bullet and a woman you're paid to protect," he said slowly, "in front of 300 witnesses, at your own considerable personal risk, and the only apology you're offering is for the ring." "I don't apologize for keeping people alive," Wren said. "I'll apologize for the paperwork, if it comes to that." Somewhere behind them, in the tangled, half-restored order of the ballroom, someone actually laughed. A short, startled sound, quickly swallowed, because laughing at a moment like this felt dangerous, and yet the tension in the room had shifted, imperceptibly, from horror toward something closer to disbelief. The woman standing at the altar in a stolen veil, wearing a ring meant for someone else, had just calmly informed the most feared man on the Gulf Coast that she didn't apologize for saving lives. Salem looked down at their joined hands one more time. By every law that governed his world, the old, unwritten law that had kept 3 generations of families from tearing each other apart in the streets, a ring given and a hand accepted before witnesses during a sanctified ceremony in front of both patriarchs was not undone by the small technicality of intent. It was not a marriage that could be quietly dissolved with an embarrassed correction and a rescheduled ceremony. In the eyes of every family in that room, in the eyes of the priest still standing frozen with the ring box in his hands, in the eyes of the 6 men from 3 rival organizations who had come specifically to witness whether the Rourke-Calder alliance would hold, the vow had been spoken. The ring had been placed. The hand had been accepted. Whatever this was, it was already binding. "You understand," Salem said, quiet enough now that it was almost only for her, "that you didn't just save Vivian Calder's life today." "I'm aware," Wren said, and for the first time, something flickered behind the flat calm of her expression. Not fear, but the sharp recalculation of a woman who had walked into that ballroom prepared to die anonymously in the shadow of someone else's wedding, and was instead walking out of it, bound, publicly and irreversibly, to the very man whose empire she had just helped save from being burned down by his own second-in-command. "I also just became your wife," she added, which was not, strictly speaking, part of the job. Salem Rourke did not smile easily, and he did not smile then either, but something in his gray eyes shifted, a fraction of a degree, the way ice shifts right before it begins, almost imperceptibly to crack. "No," he agreed, "it wasn't." He did not let go of her hand. What followed in the hours after that ballroom emptied was not the wedding night either family had planned, and it was certainly not the wedding night Wren Ashby had ever imagined for herself in a life that had, until 11 days earlier, been built entirely around staying unseen. Desmond Calder demanded answers in a private room off the West Hall, his voice raw with the particular fury of a father who had come within a single misdirected bullet of burying his only daughter. Vivian sat pale and shaking beside him, gripping Wren's free hand, the one that wasn't currently attached to Salem Rourke by a hastily improvised but binding vow, and repeating over and over a thank you that Wren didn't quite know how to accept, because in her line of work, gratitude was a currency she'd never learned to hold on to. Salem, for his part, disappeared for nearly 40 minutes into the room where Cassian Vale was being held, and when he returned, his knuckles were faintly reddened, and his expression had settled into something colder and more final than anything Wren had seen from him yet. He did not tell her what had been said in that room. She did not ask. There were some silences, she was learning quickly, that belonged entirely to him. It was nearly midnight before the 2 of them were finally alone, in a study lined floor to ceiling with the kind of leather-bound books that existed more as architecture than reading material, a fire burning low in the hearth, the ring still heavy and unfamiliar on Wren's finger. Salem stood by the window with a glass of something dark and untouched in his hand, watching the dark line of the Gulf beyond the estate's grounds, and for a long time, neither of them spoke. "You could have let her take the shot," he said finally, without turning around. "You had a fraction of a second to decide, and the safer option, for you, was to let the chaos happen and step in after. Instead, you put yourself directly into the line of a bullet, meant for someone else, for a woman you'd known 6 months, doing a job most people in your position would have quietly resigned from the moment they found a threat like this. That's not how protection works, Ren said. You don't get to wait and see if the bad outcome happens before you decide it was worth preventing. That's not an answer to what I asked. She considered him for a long moment. This man who had built an empire out of silence and inevitability, who had just watched his own second-in-command dismantled in front of 300 witnesses, who had spent an entire wedding ceremony without once raising his voice, even as his world nearly came apart around him. I don't know how to explain it to someone who's spent his whole life being the most dangerous person in every room, she said finally. But some of us built our whole lives around making sure the dangerous thing never reaches the people who can't protect themselves. That's not a decision I make in the moment. It's already made, before I ever walk into the room. Salem finally turned from the window. The firelight caught the gray of his eyes and made them, briefly, look almost warm. Cassian confessed everything, he said. The shooter, the financial trail, 8 months of planning to bleed my organization from the inside and let the Calders take the blame for a war I would have started myself, believing they'd betrayed the peace. His jaw tightened. 8 months, and I never saw it. You saw it in 11 days. I had less to lose by looking closely, Ren said quietly. You had a lifetime of trusting him. That's generous of you. I'm not being generous. I'm being accurate. She looked down at the ring on her hand, heavier than she'd expected, gold catching the low firelight, a symbol she had never once, in any version of her carefully unremarkable life, imagined wearing. What happens now? To the arrangement, to the marriage that wasn't supposed to be a marriage. Salem crossed the room slowly, the fire throwing his shadow long across the floor between them, and stopped close enough that she had to tilt her head slightly to hold his gaze. By the old law, the vow stands, he said. I could annul it quietly. Pay whatever needs paying. Send you back to whatever life you had before 11 days ago, and no one outside that ballroom would ever question it twice. He paused. That would be the easy answer. But I've spent 17 years surrounded by people who tell me exactly what they think I want to hear, Salem said. And in one afternoon, you contradicted me twice, corrected my assumptions about my own security, dismantled a plot I should have caught myself, and told me, to my face, that you don't apologize for keeping people alive. Something shifted in his voice, low and deliberate. I find that I am not, in fact, interested in the easy answer. Ren held perfectly still, the way she had been trained to hold still in the seconds before deciding whether a room was safe, and found, for the first time in longer than she could remember, that the danger in front of her didn't feel like the kind she needed protection from. That's a reckless decision for a man who built an empire on never being reckless, she said. Perhaps, Salem said. Or perhaps I've simply never before met someone worth being reckless for. Outside, the gulf moved dark and endless against the shore, indifferent to the treaties and betrayals and vows that had reshaped, in a single afternoon, the balance of power along its coastline. Inside that firelit study, a woman who had spent her career disappearing into the edges of other people's stories stood at the center of one for the first time in her life, bound by a ring that was never meant for her, to a man who had never once, in 17 years, allowed anyone close enough to surprise him. And somewhere beneath the careful stillness they both wore like armor, something had already begun. Quiet, dangerous, and entirely unplanned. The way the truest things in this world so often begin. Before we go any further into what happens between Salem and Ren in the weeks that follow, the war Cassian's allies try to start from behind bars, the truth about who really sent that warning note to Vivian's pillow, and the choice Ren has to make about whether the ring on her hand becomes something she chooses, not just something fate handed her. If you're the kind of listener who loves stories built on power, obsession, betrayal, and the kind of tension that keeps you up long after the video ends, this is exactly the channel for you. Hit that like button, subscribe to the Mafia Boss Stories, and tell me in the comments. If you were Ren, standing at that altar with a stranger's ring on your hand and an entire crime family watching, would you have run or would you have stayed? Because Ren stayed. And staying was about to cost her more than either of them expected. The days that followed the wedding were not the quiet aftermath either family anticipated. Desmond Calder, shaken by how close he'd come to burying his daughter, doubled down on the alliance rather than retreating from it. Grief and gratitude, Ren had learned, made men do things that pure strategy never would have. Vivian, for her part, took to visiting the Rourke estate twice a week, not out of any romantic entanglement with the man she'd nearly married, but because she and Ren had formed, in the crucible of that single terrifying afternoon, the kind of bond that doesn't ask permission to exist. Cassian Vale was not killed. Salem, to the surprise of nearly everyone in his organization, chose a slower reckoning, a public unraveling of every lie Cassian had told, delivered piece by piece to the men who had once trusted him, until the man who had spent 8 months quietly building a coup found himself with no allies left to build it among. Dead men become martyrs, Salem told Ren one evening, when she asked why he hadn't simply ended it the old way. Disgraced men become warnings. I'd rather my organization remember why loyalty matters than mourn someone who tried to burn it down. It was, Ren thought, the first time she'd heard him explain a decision instead of simply making one. She filed the observation away the way she filed everything, quietly, carefully, aware that a man like Salem Rourke revealed himself in inches, not confessions. The marriage, unplanned and unchosen, did not resolve itself the way either of them might have expected. There was no annulment. There was no quiet legal correction sending Ren back to the anonymous life she'd built her entire career around protecting. Instead, there were dinners that started as strategy sessions and ended, more often than either of them admitted out loud, in conversations that had nothing to do with strategy at all. There were early mornings when Salem found Ren already awake, running the estate's perimeter, the way she'd run perimeters her whole adult life, unable to fully set down the vigilance that had kept other people alive for so long. And instead of telling her to stop, he started running beside her, silent, matching her pace, until the two of them had built a routine that belonged to no one but them. 3 weeks after the wedding, Ren finally allowed herself to ask the question she'd been avoiding since the moment the ring first slid onto her FI. If the shooting hadn't happened, she said, standing on the terrace where the ceremony had taken place, the same spot where a bullet had nearly ended a young woman's life instead of joining 2 strangers' hands. If none of this had gone wrong, would you have ever looked at me twice, a bodyguard standing at the edge of someone else's wedding? Salem was quiet for a long moment, considering the question with the same weight he gave everything. Probably not, he admitted. I would have seen a woman doing her job well, and I would have respected that, and I would have gone on with my life exactly as I'd planned it. He turned to face her fully, the gray of his eyes steady in the fading evening light. That's the strange mathematics of it, Ren. The very thing that was never supposed to happen. The mistake, the wrong hand, the ring that belonged to someone else, is the only reason I know who you actually are. Not the woman standing at the edge of the room. The one who steps into the center of it when everyone else freezes. That's a dangerous way to fall for someone, Ren said quietly. Through an accident. Everything about my life is dangerous, Salem said. I'd rather it be dangerous with you standing in it than safe with anyone else standing beside me. She didn't have an answer for that. Not a clever one, not a guarded one, Not the kind of careful non-answer she'd spent 6 years perfecting in rooms far more hostile than this one. She simply reached for his hand, the same hand that had slid a ring onto her finger by mistake 3 weeks earlier, and let their fingers close together, deliberately this time. Chosen. This time. Behind them, the estate's lights glimmered against the dark water of the Gulf, and somewhere far below, the ordinary machinery of an empire kept turning. Ships still moving through ports, men still following orders, an entire world built on power and silence, and the old, unspoken laws that had once decided who married whom and why. But for the first time in longer than either of them could remember, none of that mattered as much as the two people standing quietly on that terrace, bound by an accident. Neither of them regretted anymore. If you were captivated by Ren's hidden strength and Salem's dark, unexpected devotion, don't forget to hit that like button. We love bringing you these intense stories filled with betrayal, power, and unexpected twists. What would you have done in Ren's shoes? Walked away from a marriage that was never meant to be yours, or stayed and let the wrong ring become the right one? Drop a comment below and let us know. Make sure to subscribe to the Mafia Boss Stories and turn on notifications so you never miss a story.